great-grandmother, Sheila Collis, was a very interesting woman with a life filled with stories. She was born in 1927 and died in 2017 at the age of 89. I was 10. Growing up, I would have dinner with her, my parents, and my grandparents every Sunday night. Sheila's husband, Paul Collis, died in 2007, a few months after I was born. During these Sunday dinners, we would rotate who was cooking every night. Sometimes it would be at my house, but others it would be at my grandparents' house or my great-grandmother's house, and she would cook. To me, Sheila Collis was grandmother, even though she was technically my great-grandmother, and her daughter, Vicky Stebbin, was grandma. I knew Sheila growing up, but I only ever knew her in her old age. It wasn't until after she was gone that I started really hearing stories about her life and what kind of woman she was outside of being the sweet old lady that I knew. I found myself being drawn to the version of her I was learning about through these stories, and I wanted to know more. Through this experience of interviewing those who were closest to her during her life, I think I've gained a greater understanding and appreciation of who Sheila Collis was and the impact she had on those around her. In order to start learning more about Sheila Collis and her life, I decided to first sit down with Sheila's daughter and my grandma, Vicky Stebbin. Can you tell me a little bit about your mom?
My mom was born in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, and my dad was born here in Martinsburg. And during the war or after the war, I think it was right after World War II, she came to live with her sister here in Martinsburg and worked in the mills, and that's where they met.
Do you know anything about her education?
High school, but she was very, very smart, and she took a government test. I forget what it was called, but anyway, she took it in White Sulphur and she scored so high on it, they sent her to Baltimore. So that's how she got wound up in Baltimore.
They sent her to Baltimore for college or for high school?
To work for the Social Security Administration is how she started out before she moved over to NSA.
Did she go to college at all or no?
No.
No.
So
did your mom ever tell you anything about her childhood?
very little. The only thing I remember, she used to talk about her house burned down because she'd always wanted a doll, and she finally got a doll for Christmas, and their house burned down in February. So, but she didn't talk much. My mother was a very quiet person. She kept a lot to herself.
Through sitting down and talking with my grandma about her mother, I learned a lot about Sheila that I hadn't known before. But I also realized that there were sides of Sheila that my grandma never really got to know about. In order to get the story of someone with a slightly different perspective, I decided to sit down with my father, Jason Stebbin, who is Vicky's son and Sheila Collis's only grandchild. Every summer in his childhood, no matter where he was living at the time, he would always come up to West Virginia to stay with Sheila and her husband, Paul Collis, for the summer. Both me and my father call Paul Collis Pop Pop. During this time staying with his grandparents, my dad would spend his time working on the cattle farm that the family owned. So I know you came up here for the summers when you were a kid. What were those like with living with grandmother and Pop Pop?
It was very much back in time. Pop Pop and I would work all day on the farm. So we would get up, kind of make our own breakfast, and then we would go out and work in the fields and do whatever needed to be done. And then we would come home and grandmother would have a hot home-cooked lunch for us. And then we would go back out and keep working. And then come back in and she prepared dinner. That was kind of her role on the farm, was she made sure that all of the hands and everybody else was well fed and did what they were supposed to do on the farm. She did do a lot of gardening and canning and things like that, so we really appreciated that.
The story that I had heard about my great-grandmother that intrigued me the most prior to going into these interviews was about her role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. From 1945 to 1991, the United States was engaged in the Cold War with the Soviets. This was a period of economical and political clashing between the two nations. The Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the largest confrontations in the Cold War. It started on October 16, 1962, when the United States government received a photograph from an American U-2 spy plane that had made a high-altitude pass over Cuba. The picture showed a Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile being assembled for installation. This missile was just 90 miles from the southern tip of Florida and would have been capable of reaching various targets along the East Coast, namely Washington, D.C. This discovery kicked off a 13-day panic in both the government and the general public, as the president and his government struggled to deal with this diplomatic crisis. My great-grandmother was involved in all of it. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your experience during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, well, I was kind of right in the middle of it because my mother was involved. My mom actually saw the pictures before Kennedy did, and she called my dad at work and told him to come take me out of school, and we actually came to Martinsburg because the bomb radius was 60 miles, and Martinsburg was 60 miles out. And it was very emotional.
What did you do once you got to Martinsburg?
Pardon? What? We stayed with my grandmother, and my mom didn't come home for 4 days. She was at work for 4 days, but then it got solved. So, but it was a really, really scary time.
Do you know like what she was doing at her work?
No, it was top secret. She had eyes only security clearance. I don't know if you know what that means, but so no, I don't know. I just know that she saw the pictures. She was on the Caribbean desk at that time. She worked for the National Security Agency, and she was on the Caribbean desk, and when she saw the pictures, she pushed them up the chain, and that's how it all started.
What happened when your dad came to get you from school?
I was scared, but Mom just wanted us out of there because we came very, very close to war.
So you were telling me a while ago about you were watching a movie with her and like she opened up about what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Can you tell me about that at all?
We went and saw an exhibit at the Florida Museum about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and she realized with what was being told and what was being set forth in the display that she kind of could talk about things that she kept quiet for many years, because she took her official debriefing very seriously. And then we watched the movie. We went to the exhibit about the Cuban Missile Crisis and looked at that. And then we came home and watched a movie called 13 Days, which is about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And after that, she was kind of talkative about what happened and what she experienced. But it was a very, very rough time.
Tied to this story is another that I think really showcases the type of person Sheila Collis was. During the Cold War, around this time of the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, my grandmother worked for NSA. However, this was 1962, and women in the workplace were generally not taken seriously or given the respect they deserved. One of my family's favorite stories to tell about Sheila results from her standing up for herself and refusing to not be treated properly by the people she worked with, especially those who had more power than her.
One time she was working and a colonel in the army said, "Get me a cup of coffee, honey." And my mother said back to him, and I'll leave a couple words out, "Get your own blank coffee, I'm working here."
Well, you probably know my favorite story about hers, when the U.S. Navy captain came up to her and told her to get him a cup of coffee, and he told her she told him that she was rather busy with what she was doing, and he would have to go get his own coffee, which was pretty gutsy for a female at that time frame.
You could say the actual phrase.
Right, she said, "Excuse me, sir, I'm busy. You can get your own damn coffee."
Yeah.
That's the kind of person she was. She had a high-powered job, and she didn't mind telling the men, "Out of my way," you know.
Did she carry that like, because she seems like a very like strong like person. Did she carry that into like other parts of her life as well, like with the coffee story? No.
No, she completely compartmentalized it. Work left at the door. When she came home, she was just a regular housewife, except for the fact that I couldn't do things like couldn't have a foreign exchange student couldn't deal with foreign exchange students, things like that. In that respect, the work came home. But as far as talking about it, never, never.
Is there anything else you want to share about her?
She really enjoyed the time that we would spend on Sunday dinners together, and when she got later in life, she would go through her cookbooks for a week if it was her turn to cook, and she would very much pore over what she was going to make for Sunday dinner when it was her turn. So it was her responsibility, and she took it seriously, and I think that's something I'll always remember as much as she. Even though it was later in life and it was another chapter, she was still keeping up and still feeding everybody and doing what she needed to do.
So is there anything else you want to say about like either of your parents?
Nope.
No?
Just that I miss them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Going into these interviews, I thought the topic I was going to focus on was my grandma's, Vicky Stedman's, experience during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But as I began conducting my interviews, it became increasingly obvious to me that the real focus of the story I needed to tell wasn't the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but rather the life of my great-grandmother, Sheila Collis. Growing up, I did have a relationship with my grandmother, but I wouldn't say we were especially close. To me, she was a little old lady who lived in the big stone house, who we would have dinner with every Sunday. She was sweet and loved to cook. She was considerate enough to have puzzles, Legos, coloring books, hula hoops, and jump ropes for me to play with while I was at her house, so I wouldn't be too bored while the adults talked. She was caring enough to make shrimp all the time and put up with eating them, even though she didn't like them very much, just because she thought I liked them. She was the woman who was stubborn enough to load dishes into her dishwasher every time we were at her house, just to unload them back into her sink right after we had left and hand wash them all herself just because she didn't want us to know that her dishwasher was broken. She was also stubborn enough to not let on how much pain she was in when she was suffering from what we suspect was cancer. She was the person who we would drive to visit in hospice after school, a place that always felt too colorless and bland to have her in it. I loved my grandmother, but looking back on her life now, I can't quite conjure up her face or picture her personality. Only the stories remain. And it is through these stories and anecdotes that I remember her. This is the power of stories. They let us remember the people who are long gone, even if we can't quite picture their faces or remember their voices. It keeps memories alive. It helps inspire the future. I know looking back on my grandmother's life, I am definitely inspired. My grandmother was strong and resilient during a time when strong and resilient weren't things that women were meant to be. This is why it is important to remember her story. Through remembering her strength, we can remember our own. I came into this experience with a desire to get to know my great-grandmother. And through conducting these interviews, in a small way, I think I have.